Well, good afternoon if you are in snowy New York City or sunny Miami, or good evening in Europe and Africa, and good late night and early morning in parts further east. It is Friday, January 7th, 2022, our first show of 2022. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio, as you know, is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. And as listeners know, I tend to invite people who inspire me. In some cases, they're people I know very, very well. In today's case, it's Susan Danis. Je veux dire Suzanne Danis by your French pronunciation, because even though Susan is American born, her heritage is French. And she told me that the pronunciation originally is Danis. So I will use that, Danis. And she is the general director and CEO of the Florida Grand Opera, one of America's oldest opera companies. To my knowledge, we've never met, but you're someone whose career I've followed for a long time. And we had a very dear person in common. And I want to talk to you about him a little later, because he told me all kinds of wonderful things about you, which only inspired me more to have you join me today. So Susan, bienvenue, welcome, bienvenidos.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you. So I'm speaking to you from snowy New York, and I know you're originally from the northeastern part of the United States. And in doing a brief summation of your long career, you started in Saratoga, went to Sarasota, and then to Miami. And Saratoga in upstate New York, a beautiful place, being the Lake George Opera. And then the historic and really wonderful Sarasota Opera that you really helped grow into an institution, including the restoration of their really gorgeous 1926 theater. It's a company that specializes in Verdi, not only, but it's very famous. It's often called Parma on the Gulf of Mexico or something like that. And then Florida Grand Opera, which is a very historic company. I'll give the summation of it, and if I left anything out, you'll tell me. In 1941, the Greater Miami Opera was founded by Arturo Di Filippi, a tenor, who sang Canio in their first performance. And in 1945, the Opera Guild of Fort Lauderdale was, I don't know if it was founded by Di Filippi, but he sang in Il Trovatore in their first performance. The companies merged in 1994. And one thing that's particular about this company that very few others have, I know that the Arizona Opera has this situation, is that they're really anchored in two cities and have DNA in both and have audiences in both that are very different. I've worked a fair amount at Arizona Opera, and I can tell you that the, quote, founders in Tucson have a proprietary feeling about the company. But on the other hand, the people of Phoenix are the ones who fund it, and that's where the audience growth has been. So they have quite a distance, literally, to travel between those two cities. The distance between Miami and Fort Lauderdale is not all that great. South Florida is densely populated. It's very diverse. Because we've never met, we have never discussed this, but it's an area I know incredibly well for my whole life and have worked a lot, especially at Palm Beach Opera, but know all of Florida, and is now, in terms of population, the third largest in America. It is a state that is ridiculed, but it's also beloved. And it is a fascinating ethnic, urban, agricultural mix. It has alligators, it has palm trees, it has just about everything. And therefore, it has opera. And in the case of Sarasota, to have this rather old opera company with a beautiful old theater in a community, and it's a place I know well. Did you know June LaBelle?
Oh, of course I did. Knew June very, very, very
Let's
well.
talk a bit about June. June was the first female presenter on WQXR, where I'm at, which is America's oldest classical music radio station. She was brilliant, talented, beautiful, a great presenter, a great advocate for the arts. And when 9/11 happened here in New York, she lived very close to the World Trade Center, and she just up and left, and she moved to Sarasota, where her family had a home. And she became one of the real leaders in the arts community in Sarasota and ran something called SIL, Sarasota Institute of Lifelong Learning, where I was often a teacher. And so I would combine my visits to June and to Sarasota with visits to whatever the Sarasota Opera was doing. So what were you doing, and how did you remember June, but also talk about your own work, because she was such a vital person?
Well, first of all, having spent a good portion of my life in New York, and of course, being a QXR listener, I knew who she was. And so those of us who were either ex-New Yorkers or whatever, when she came to Sarasota, it was like a celebrity had arrived. And she, as you said, very, very quickly, I mean, not only still, she became a major music critic. She wrote for different things. I mean, I think the classical music knowledge and love probably grew exponentially when she moved to town. And she made her presence known across all the genres, but of course she was a huge opera lover. Where I really got to know June very personally was that I've known her husband, Ed Alley,
Ed,
who
yeah.
unfortunately we've also lost recently. I was very close with Ed Alley and Nancy Williams when she was alive. I know them because they both worked in their early days back at what was Lake George Opera Festival. So when they moved to Sarasota, they also reached out. So it's kind of this, continuum of people that have been in our business, such as present company, for a very long time. And so when they got together, Ed was actually at that point serving on the opera board. So I had the great opportunity to know of everything that she did, all the way from her reviewer critic's hat, all the way through, eating dinner with them, enjoying their company. I spent a lot of time with both of them, and I obviously I'd left when she was, fighting cancer, but it was like watching someone who I'd grown up with in New York come to your town, and just an explosive, wonderful, inclusive personality that, the world's a little bit duller with the loss of both of them.
It's true. Ed was also at the New York Philharmonic for a long time, and I knew him independent of June. I don't recall if June and Ed knew each other in New York or whether their meeting happened in Florida.
I think it happened in Florida.
It happened in Florida. I refer to this, and I have for decades, as Planet Opera, that you and I reside on Planet Opera. We work on it. We know of each other. We just have not, until today, actually had a chance to speak. That's the nature of this profession, that some of us, even without a pandemic, are anchored in place, and others of us travel constantly. And so I'm very glad to talk to you. You then came to Miami. Would you talk about Miami, your Miami, without me defining it, because it's such a fascinating, diverse place?
I think your summation of it was pretty dead on. I pretty much, until I pretty much lived in large cities through my life. I lived in Paris, I lived in New York, and then I lived upstate. And when I lived in Sarasota, and then it was like living in this very vanilla city. And so when I came to Miami, I just thought, I've lived in big cities. I'm a city person, and I did not know what hit me. It is exactly what you say, the balance and the cultural differences against any place else I've been in the United States, or the places I've been abroad, was just mind-boggling to me. It is such a young city. Even though we obviously have an opera audience, there still are the retirees here, but in terms of the energy and so forth, and just learning the differences between, in New York, I would say primarily most of the folks that would define themselves as being of Latin or being Hispanic were predominantly Dominican and Puerto Rican. And in Miami, first of all, no one thinks of themselves as being Hispanic. They're just white. So when you look at statistics and you look at like how they'll do the metropolitan statistical area information, sometimes it doesn't make sense, but you learn that there's a pecking order, that the Argentinians think they're better than the Colombians, who think they're better than this group. And negotiating all of that is just, it's very, very intense. Probably 75, depending where you are, Spanish is the first language spoken, and English is optional versus the way it is in most of the rest of the United States. The opportunity for just cultural enrichment is amazing because the city truly is the entire strata of socioeconomic levels, from, folks that are doing menial jobs up through some of the wealthiest people I've ever met, can be all Colombians or all Venezuelans or all Argentinians or all Cubans, of course. And there's really no need to ever leave your community. It's kind of like old New York, when you could literally never leave a neighborhood, and kind of, it was very parochial. And that still very much exists in Miami on many levels. It's the ethnic tension is very, very different. It goes between groups, and it's lived in lots of places, and there's always tension, but the tension is just like nothing I've ever experienced. But yet, with all of that, what comes out of there is just like, I can't think of any Caribbean, Central or South American cuisine that you can't get, all the way from an oat restaurant down to something that's inexpensive. And just that mixture, I've learned things about Colombian food and Honduran food and Nicaraguan food that I would have never had the opportunity to learn. And thankfully, many of those countries have vocal music traditions, and the number one thing selling in our season this year is our zarzuela concerts. Mm-hmm. And if you put zarzuela out there, it's that joyous thing where half the audience is singing along with the singers. And so I think that's one of the ways that in this very different cornucopia of people that we've been able to keep the company going for 80 years.
We had a dear friend about whom we'll speak later, but when he moved to Miami to work with your company, he sent me an email, and the title was Coconuts and Concrete.
Absolutely perfect description. It is become, I'm sorry, Fred.
And I remember many, many years ago, I believe it was Time, maybe Newsweek, but I think Time magazine did a cover story about Miami called America's Casablanca, referring to the famous film, but where anything and everything can happen, and people from all nationalities pass through there. And it's not just the Miami of the Jackie Gleason show and the Golden Girls, although there was that too, but it is so diverse. And I found interesting what you said about the Argentines and so on. I've worked a fair amount at the Teatro Colón in Buenos Aires, and I love Argentina. It's one of my favorite places, but they do think they're better than everyone else. And they communicate that to you very, not so subtly. I've also worked in Chile and Brazil in the opera companies there. And there's a huge tradition in South America, not so much Central America, of what we call grand opera. And so when these audiences, these peoples from those countries come and perhaps live in Miami or get a second home there, I imagine that they're drawn to the opera. How do you, as the head of the company, draw in all of these people, not just as ticket buyers, but as supporters, perhaps if they come from countries that don't have the tradition of art support by private people?
It is a huge challenge in this community. You kind of hit the nail on the head, so to speak, is that it's difficult because it's exactly what you said. There isn't a tradition of support. And even on top of that there is the tradition of the government supporting them. So often when we've gone in to speak with people, I'd say it takes 2 to 3 times as long to move them towards the fact that an organization needs to be supported beyond a ticket sale, because it's just not even in their DNA. Of course, there's support for church. Their incredible support within the community. If a family is having trouble within the community, people will definitely be generous and help. But it's a long journey, and it's honestly been quite difficult. If you look at our donor base, it's still predominantly Jewish. It's still predominantly, what I would call, quote, Caucasian versus Caucasian Hispanic. And it's a challenge. I've been here 10 years and I'm still working on that question, Fred.
For listeners who may not know, because we have people listening all over the world, Miami has a long tradition of having Jews from the Northeast, especially New York, either move there or have winter homes there. And my quite elderly mother, when she was but beautiful still, by the way, when she was a 10-year-old in the 1930s, she and her mother would get on the train and go to Miami for part of the winter. And my mother went to elementary and junior high school in Miami and learned Latin, because that's what they were teaching. She likes to say, from native speakers. But it goes back 100 years, this tradition of Jewish people from the Northeast finding community in South Florida, especially Fort Lauderdale, Miami, more recently, which is to say the 70s in Palm Beach County. And so there is that. And Jews historically have a disproportionate tradition of art support and support for hospitals and charities and so on. And I wonder about the degree to which let's call it the ancient Jewish community of Miami and South Florida has connected to the more recent arrivals, many from South America. And I will say Jews from Cuba and Jews from Argentina. I've known those who live in Miami.
It's very interesting, because that community that you just mentioned, actually, I would never say it because I didn't think was appropriate, but they actually call themselves Jubans. And they openly, and I'm thinking of a doctor who was on our board when I first came, and he's older now and doesn't really need board service on his list of things to do. But he told me, he said, "I'm a Juban." And I was like, "Doctor, is it okay to say that?" He goes, "Oh yeah, we all call ourselves Jubans." So I think that it's been interesting to see where that tradition intersects. And you're absolutely right. Obviously, there is that tradition of giving back. There absolutely is that intersection. And I do think I in particular have a young Latina who's at this point our youngest board member. And she and her husband own a very successful company, and she has kind of taken the reins. And at this point, she's our largest annual contributor. And she and her husband are both first generation Cuban born in the States, obviously. And she has this sense that she wants Miami to be a community that her children will want to grow up in. And she realizes that she has two young girls, and she realizes that at some point in their life, they're going to want to come off the beach and not party and want cultural opportunities. So I have started to see the handing of the torch. I have one board member who is third generation FGO. His grandparents were exactly the people you're talking about that came down from New York. I think his parents were even born in New York, but mainly raised in Miami. And he 100% raised in Miami, and now he has grown children. He's actually third generation in the tradition of growing and keeping the company going. And I have several involved patrons and donors of Latin descent that are already second generation FGO. So we are starting to see that same thing happen in, quote, the non-Jewish community, which is great.
There's something I'd like to explain to listeners, but also to me, because I struggle to get this right about Florida. Florida has counties such as Dade and Broward and Palm Beach County and Orange County, many, many. But within those counties are communities and cities. And Dade County, which is often called Miami-Dade, has the city of Miami, Miami Beach, Coconut Grove, all kinds of places. And would you, if you can, explain the political distinctions and the fact that you can have within Dade County all of these different cities where, frankly, you drive and you go through cities, you don't know you've gone from one to the next, but they all have their different jurisdictions. Perhaps you tell me they're different school systems, I don't know. And therefore, how does that work as a community, but how does that work as a major arts institution where you try to appeal to these different cities and communities?
Wow, you said a mouthful, and I guess because I've been in Florida for so long, it's the same way in basically the state, but it's definitely confusing. For example, it's kind of like the way people live. I can give you a New York example. If you, for your address, Fred, you use New York, New York. You don't use Manhattan, New York, though you live in Manhattan. But here it's even worse. At least there, it's the way, like Queens, the way Queens was incorporated, or the way Brooklyn was incorporated. And it's kind of similar to that. Our offices are in Doral, which is a city that is west of Miami, yet in anything that we write, we just write Miami. But Doral is a separate city that resides within Miami-Dade County. There's also Kendall, there's Kendall Lakes, there's, like you said, there's Miami Beach, there's Miami. So where it really gets confusing is that there is the city of Miami has its mayor, has its representatives and everything. And then there's a county. So there are two mayors in Miami, the county mayor and the city mayor. And very often they will be from different political parties. And the power, I would say, in terms of, especially for us at the funding level, and just in terms of reaching people, is truly at the county level, because Miami-Dade County is larger than, for the Americans, sorry, I can't give you European things off the top of my head. It's larger than the state of Connecticut. It's larger than Rhode Island, Delaware. It's massive. So it does give you a much larger population, all the way from the alligators you mentioned earlier, all the way down through incredibly urban, highly densely populated areas. But it is confusing because you can live in another incorporated city, yet you still are a Miami-Dade County resident, and you can put Miami on your mail, if you even get mail anymore, and it will still get to you. It's kind of like when people say they live in New York, and they may live in, they may live in Jackson Heights within Queens, but they still might write New York, New York on their mail. It's very similar. As long as you write Miami, it'll get to you. Maybe. Mail's not so good here.
And where in Miami, let's not talk about Fort Lauderdale now, but Miami, is the theater where you perform the most?
The Arsht Center, which is the big performing arts center here, sits on the edge of a neighborhood. It's technically not downtown. It's kind of south of a neighborhood called Edgewater and north of downtown. So it's very close to the water. If you go slightly east of it, you end up in Biscayne Bay and you're on your way to Miami Beach. So it's definitely in the population center versus being outlying. It's in definitely the metropolitan core, so to speak.
So people who live in Miami-Dade County, who live especially in the city of Miami and of Miami Beach. For people who don't know, in Florida, there is what's called the Intracoastal Waterway, and this very thin band of land between the Intracoastal Waterway and the Atlantic Ocean, so that often the very fanciest communities are right on the Atlantic Ocean, such as the city of Palm Beach, which is near West Palm Beach, which is the major population center, and all the way up and down. Do people feel territorial? I live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and often you see people here who say, oh no, I've not been to the East Village for 10 years or whatever. Are people in Miami similarly territorial, and do they psychologically imagine going to places for arts and entertainment or restaurants that are quite far from where they live?
Oh, yes, it is a real challenge, complicated by traffic, but you're absolutely right. It's the same as, I don't know if the same level of loyalty as the Upper West Side, yet I can kind of heat map where most of our audience comes from. And we've started doing more events out in our actual rehearsal performance space. And it's very interesting. People from only certain directions will make the pilgrimage to Doral to come see a free concert or something. So absolutely, we're getting more and more people as it gets more and more crowded, who, especially because this is a drive city, it is, they're trying very hard to not make it such, but it's absolutely territorial. People will think that's too far to go. I mean, it's 30 something miles to Fort Lauderdale, to where we perform from most parts of Miami. You would think it was 100 miles away. It's just the thought of having to cross into another county just makes it, not even a possibility for people. So yes, people are very territorial and very tuned into their particular area.
So because your company is the child of two parents, one from Fort Lauderdale, one from Miami, there are historical roots in Fort Lauderdale, where there also is a very large arts community, a lot of them historically Jewish, a lot of them disproportionate to the size of the city, gay, who are often big art supporters. And many of these gay people, especially, have come from elsewhere and have retired in Fort Lauderdale, and therefore look for opera and performing arts. Do they similarly not drive to Miami? Is it too far? Or how do you balance it in terms of, I'm going to use a very technical word, delivering arts to two different cities?
Well, for me, one of the things that I've done since I've gotten here is decentralize as much as I can, because while putting big opera in the big venues, in order to really reach the community, and the community, I say, is a big word, all these different neighborhoods, you're right, they don't want to make the pilgrimage, besides the fact that we're also dealing with people thinking, it's a big, scary structure. So at this point, every single thing we do, I'm talking off of, let's say, big main stage operas, if I do it in Miami somewhere, I do it in Broward. So, and Broward is the name of the county where Fort Lauderdale resides. So we do everything from small concerts. We're doing a series of spirituals, jazz, and we have Zarzuela and Motown. And every single concert we're doing in Miami, I have to do it in Fort Lauderdale, because nobody will drive in opposite directions. And it makes it, some of the ones that are super popular, it's not a problem, but with doing that, of course, it gives twice as much of a burden for filling the audience and so forth. Yet, whenever I put something out in a neighborhood, it really does work. You get an entirely different audience. And then, of course, the challenge for all of us is getting them back and getting them to go see the big operas in the performing arts centers. But you hit the nail on the head. I have to do things, the guys who live in Oakland Park and Wilton Manors aren't going to drive down to here to see something. I've sourced things up there, and vice versa. I don't know how many Miamians, we do bus service to get them up to go see fellow travelers in April. So absolutely, I have to run things in both communities and try to keep everyone happy.
So with my guest on the show, which began at the earliest days of the pandemic, April 24th, 2020, with Thomas Hampson, Christine Gerke, Ben Heppner, Ferruccio Furlanetto, I've tried not to focus on the pandemic. I want to talk about their art and their work in general. With you, Susan, I'm going to make an exception. I think it's important because you are an esteemed manager who is known to be very nimble in the face of challenges. And I want to talk to you about how you personally and how you as a company reacted to what the pandemic imposed, but very especially Florida being a warm weather destination and many people come in the winter. Many Florida opera companies have their seasons now. The Met this year will be dark in February, and they plan to do that, I think, anyway, to have a break in midwinter so the company could regenerate, but also because a big piece of their audience are elderly Jews and Italians who have come down to Florida, and Latinos. And so therefore, they go to the counties of South Florida and look for art and culture. And so how did you retool and get the company ready? You're preparing your season now, and you open, I believe, at the end of this month of January.
Well, first of all, we didn't stop through the pandemic. I think my staff was ready to strangle me, but what I saw it was that it was an opportunity to do repertoire that I can't do in the big performing arts center. So unfortunately, I think my staff kind of kept it a big secret, but it basically did an all-American season in the middle of the pandemic last year. We went into a really small theater and we basically produced a live season because my audience, I mean, anybody who's jumped into the streaming market and has been successful, my hat is off to them. But my folks didn't want to pay money to see something streamed. So I said, I'll develop a season that I can keep everybody safe first and foremost. It's not too big. We can pull it together. And also I can put repertoire out there that is riskier for us, but I have less risk because I really do only have 200 seats to sell, and the budgets are smaller. So I'm sure my staff would have preferred that I just took a big break, but we produced through it. I think it gave the audience a lot of sense that we were going to continue to move forward. Yet, going back to the big house is a very, very different thing. And we normally open in November each year, and we waited, and indeed we open on the 22nd of January. We're moving ahead with great speed, no worries, feeling really good. Now I'm pulling my hair out because this thing called Omicron has emerged. So, we, like every company, we'd had all our things in place, and testing, sanitation, everything. And when this happened, it really kicked it into another level. So we had to take the journey of if we were even going to move forward. And I really had to make sure that we were shored up, that we knew what we were going to do, because I can tell you that we're testing really, really regularly. And, every time we test, 3 of our stagehands will test out, and, and we've suffered from the great resignation like everyone else. There are very few guys left in our local. Stagehands are few and far between these days, because of course they didn't work for almost 2 years and they all had to find something else to do. So it's really a challenge. Yet we kind of sat down and laid it all out, and we've been waiting a long time to do this. And a lot of people put a lot of energy into it, especially the principals and all of us. And I'm very excited about doing the piece. And so we've covered every exposure that we humanly can. And we're gonna move forward. Looking at all the trends, I think Omicron will have peaked and be on the way down in Florida and in densely populated areas by the time we open. And so we're moving full steam ahead. But I can tell you, I've lost a bit of sleep in the last week and a half, and pulled out a few hairs, but excited to be moving forward.
May I ask, to the degree that you feel comfortable talking about it, I would ask this to the head of any opera company. How are contracts written, or perhaps how are they written differently nowadays in the face of pandemics? There is what's called force majeure, where something beyond our control has prevented us from staging a performance. But when you or your team negotiate with the representatives of singers or with composers, directors, conductors, what is part of the new calculation?
I think there are a couple. First of all, there wasn't anything specific that changed in like an AGMA contract. The force majeure language didn't change, certainly, and there isn't anything consistent from the agent side of the table, so to speak. Some agents tried to change the payment schedule, tried to build in things that, since obviously opera singers come off book when they come to rehearsal. They know their role, they're ready to go and start staging. So it really was very, very individually. I think the change has come on the opera side. I think it's come on the company side, that we have done the calculus, as you said, of like, this could still happen. And so what do we have to be prepared for financially if it does, so that we can make good on contracts that, you know, people have put the work in. You know, we all got caught like totally by surprise the first time around, but that was almost 2 years ago. So speaking for myself, and I can say that, I would say on behalf of my colleagues, I think everybody did the work on the opera side so that we can, you know, we can honor contracts to the best of our abilities, and make sure that, you know, we don't leave people high and dry.
Is this the kind of thing that one discusses with board members, and how does the board get involved, either in supporting these decisions or sometimes challenging these decisions? I've been there, so I know. Talk about, if you care to, your experience, but I mean, as a means of teaching others. That's why I'm asking.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think one of the most interesting things that happens, especially with new board members, is they haven't even grasped the concept that sales don't cover costs. Because if you're a straight business person, why would you go into business and do something where, you know, what comes out of your main revenue stream is, you know, if you're lucky, it covers, in a good company, 40-something% of your costs, and the rest is fundraising or whatever. So, you know, I even board members who have been around for a long time will be like, well, why are we doing that if we're not going to make money? Like, well, that's why we have not-for-profit status, because, you know, that's where the generosity and grants and everything else comes in. So it's absolutely a discussion. And, you know, I've certainly, not just here, but anywhere I've worked, definitely encountered hard charging business people that are just like, if you can get away with not paying that, don't pay it. I mean, in a pure like bottom line scenario, versus thinking about that there's a person on the other end of that contract that, you know, has to go back and pay their rent wherever they live or whatever, and they don't have work for the next X amount of weeks or months in a longer contract. And so, yeah, it's not everybody is just like, sure, let's, you know, throw money out, but it is an educational process. And I've always found that the closer I can pull those people to getting to know the people that are on stage, or getting to really understand what it takes to put the setup, it becomes more real. They can't separate themselves from it, you know, because they do know who that person is that isn't going to be getting a paycheck or whatever. And that's kind of always been my strategy, to try to get people to realize that, you know, we don't just open the curtain and, you know, ta-da. We've worked really hard for months and months and months, and hundreds of people have been involved to make the curtain go up and give them an enjoyable experience.
I've often been in the position of explaining this to boards. I've been hired by companies to come talk to their board specifically about this stuff as sort of a neutral outsider, rather than it coming from the manager. And especially when people are from other countries, as you probably have in Miami, but also when I've done this in Europe, they're amazed to discover that in the States, at least, if someone doesn't go on, she doesn't get paid. And it may be for any number of reasons, but it might be that she has a cold, or maybe tested positive for COVID or whatever, and therefore suddenly loses planned income. And that becomes very hard for the artist. And if you live in Germany, where you may be part of a company and you are a civil servant, in the case of Austria, those considerations are softer than happens here in the hard realities of North America. Mm-hmm. So especially because we still don't have healthcare for everyone here. We try, right, but we don't really have that. So many of our singers either have to do all kinds of other things, or they move to Europe, mm-hmm, where they're able to live under a social program and so on. And it's an ongoing struggle that I know Absolutely. That you managers face every day that the public doesn't know about. I want to talk about your upcoming season, and then I want to take the time we have left to talk about our dear friend. You have Andre Previn's A Streetcar Named Desire. You have Verdi's Rigoletto. You have, I suddenly forgot his name, it starts with a
Gregory
P.
Spears.
Spears, Fellow Travelers, which I saw the premiere of in Cincinnati. It's marvelous. I gave the talk before the performance. And Handel's Sexy, Sexy, Sexy Agrippina, which is maybe the sexiest opera of all the operas I can think of, more than Rigoletto, you name it. That's really the one. I mean, there are sexual issues in all four of these operas that you're presenting, as there are in practically every opera but Boris Godunov. And where I've not found a vein of sexual pulse yet, but though I love the opera, maybe Kovanchin are the same. But Streetcar, which premiered in San Francisco based on the play by Tennessee Williams, is a wonderful work. And I do hope that people will go see it in both cities, in Fort Lauderdale and Miami. Rigoletto, I think, can speak for itself, but I want to talk about the last two, Fellow Travelers and Agrippina. Fellow Travelers, you've programmed only for Fort Lauderdale and not for Miami. Why is that?
Because one of the challenges in our area is venues. We have these huge performing art centers, with all the infrastructure, and the Arsh being the second largest theater in the United States after the Met in terms of the stage and everything. We just don't have the substage because you'd be underwater. And the piece, I enjoyed the piece years ago, and I thought I'd really love to bring this. And the problem is it doesn't work, and it's too intimate of a piece to work in a big house. And we've been very fortunate that in Broward County, again, talking just what you're talking about with these huge counties, there are all these cities that have built these small performing arts centers. So the Lauderhill Performing Arts Center is a 1,000-seat house, incredible pit, and the pit's amazing, and fully functioning stage house, yet because it's 1,000 seats, it's much smaller. And I don't have a sister space to that in Miami-Dade. There is a place very, very far south, totally illustrating your point, Fred, that's in Homestead, basically, called the South Miami-Dade Cultural Arts Center, a little smaller audience, but about the same stage house and orchestra size. I couldn't sell it down there. So when we decided to do this work, and if I had had a space in Miami, we would have done it in both places. It's obviously also something to serve a community. Lauderhill is very close to the epicenter of Oakland Park and Wilton Manors. And obviously we've developed great connections and great, shared interest in the LGBTQ community. So it's definitely something that is specifically targeted so that it's easy for us to serve that community, and a lot of the various things that we've put in place. But it's a pretty venue specific piece. And unfortunately, there is the mega centers, and that's it in Miami-Dade. There's that wonderful 1,000-seat venue is missing.
Briefly, unless you want me to, tell the story of Fellow Travelers and its importance. I think it's a modern masterpiece.
I do too. Which story do I tell? Do I tell the Lavender story, or do I tell the story between Tim and Hawk? I mean, it's so many different things, but historically in the United States, it specifically centers around the time known as Lavender Scare, where basically McCarthy, who many people know about McCarthyism and his pursuit of communists, he kind of ran out of communists, so to speak, and looking in Hollywood and so forth, and started to target the LGBTQ community, which was not even known as that at that point. There wasn't even really language.
The term was homosexual.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And it's certainly the story of what happens with that, but it's how that affects a very, what was the word I even want to use? The relationship between an older, basically Washington insider, Hawk, and a young man, Tim, who basically ends up having his first sexual encounter with an older man. And it's certainly the true center of the story is the relationship that develops and it occurs between the two of them. All Timothy's issue with his Catholic upbringing,
Yeah.
and Hawk being an older man with much experience, and his exploitation, let's say, of that situation. But the music is incredible, and there are moments of tenderness in that piece that can, as you said, can rival just about anything. It's really quite a tour de force, little teeny piece.
And I will add that there's another very important character, and I don't hear her described as much as she should be, Mary Johnson, who is so fundamental to the story, in a way sees with her eyes what we see with our eyes. And it's so beautifully constructed. The libretto is by Greg Pierce. And that makes the opera so much richer than basically a story, and forgive the old language, of illicit love. Right. That is interrupted by politics and stupidity. But Mary Johnson is a very rich character. And
yes, absolutely.
I want people also to focus on her. Now,
and so essential to Tim.
Yes, speaking of sex, Agrippina. I believe, and maybe you'll do this one day, that an opera company should simultaneously do the Incoronazione di Poppaea of Monteverdi, the coronation of Poppaea, and Agrippina, because there are many of the same characters told beautifully but very differently, even though one is about 1641 and the other is about 70 years later. But the fascinating depictions of these characters and of the sordid but sexy life in ancient Rome and power plays and so on, because frankly, without underlining it too much or getting too political, we see these situations nowadays. I'll leave it at that. And therefore, when people say to me, is opera relevant? Oh, yes. And the fact that in 1641 and 1709 or whatever it was that Agrippina was produced, that these operas speak to timeless human themes and incredibly relevantly and humorously in this case, is a miracle. So why did you pick Agrippina, and who is your audience?
Oh, goodness. Okay, first of all, we're doing it in a Mason's temple. It's a, I really do, I get a different audience when I go to a different space, and that Masonic temple isn't as scary as the Arch Center. So there are people that I can potentially get to come in. And we were looking at, money drives everything. I mean, if I had my vision, there would be very different opera on the stage. I have a vision, but I have to make it match the budget every year, which we all do. And so we knew we needed to do a piece that was smaller, that really there wasn't chorus. And we hadn't done anything early music for a while. And I do like to balance the repertoire, even though I'll tend to go more towards 20th, 21st century. So I'm like, okay, I better balance this out. But you're right. It is like the penultimate, sex story. But I think what hit me that really moved me forward to do it is a couple of things. I was inspired by the fact that in this Masonic temple, they have all these, from the early 20s when this place was built, these incredible scenic drops. And I started thinking, my inspiration kind of came from the fact that I was like, oh my goodness, that's Agrippina. That's, that's this scene, that's that scene. And I thought, so we're kind of doing it almost as an old school pipe and drape show, and I, of course, even see it where, you see you see the drop just kind of fall almost comically. But then I kind of took it to another level, because certainly there isn't anybody on the planet. Well, I mean, maybe there are, but in the States, I mean, everybody watched Bridgerton, and set in the Regency period in England. And I thought through all the similarities of, it's from the design standpoint, it's high classic, and here you have the classic period. So I can't say because Netflix won't let me, but I'm setting it kind of a la Bridgerton. And also one of the things in Bridgerton that certainly the fact that they blind cast and that at
blind cast, meaning that we don't pay attention to the color, the race,
Correct.
perhaps the gender of different people. In
Right.
this opera, the gender, yeah.
And so we flipped up. I really got inspired by this, the one episode where the queen explains why there are Latin people in the court in that time, and why there are people of all colors in the court. And I thought, so it's mainly a Black cast. And we just, I don't, as there at this point, there's one person that would quote be Caucasian, but I wanted to kind of roll with what had happened there, because of course everybody's trying to make sure that they're incorporating Black Lives Matters. And so a lot of the same works are being done a lot. But I was like, when I've talked to people, when we offered roles, people are like, oh, no one ever thought of me for that role, or they would normally not cast me in that role. So I thought, if we're going to shake it up, let's shake it up. So it's going to kind of be a la Regency, a la, and Jeff Buckman, who's the stage director, who's brilliant, is even taking it to another level of doing it as a movie about that period and about the story being set within an early Hollywood soundstage, so to speak. So, because certainly with my audience, if they don't know the plot, I can move when it is. If they know it, if I move a barber or a bohème or whatever, they get very upset. They want, they want tradition of, Rigoletto is Rigoletto. So that's kind of how I came up with it. And the space is really fantastic. It's super, super small, fewer than 800 seats. It'll have much more of a European feel to the experience than your typical American ginormous performing arts center.
A question I had not thought to ask, but I will now, and I'm not naming names. It's not gossip, but I just respect people's privacy. Many active and retired opera singers actually live in Florida because of the tax advantages. And I don't know whether you ever think to use some of them as performers, but many of them would be wonderful mentors, teachers, or perhaps solo recitalists. I was a very close friend of Evelyn Lear, who I grew up in the same building on the same floor as she lived when she sang at the Met, and she and Thomas Stewart, her husband, were wonderful to me as a little kid, encouraging me about opera. And then they moved to Fort Lauderdale and were very active and taught there. And I can think of other superstars, retired and not, who live in Florida.
Yes.
And do you engage with them at all in terms of inclusion in the company, either as performers or mentors or whatever?
Oh, absolutely. And we do have a new crop that's just come in, but Evelyn and Tom were fixtures in this company. Before she became a little bit more infirm, we did a lot with Virginia Zayani. I mean, now she's farther up. I know Kim Josephson's just gotten here recently, and he's actually going to star in a production of The Leopard at UM. So absolutely, there's been a long history of it. Of course, when Renata Scotto was here, a fixture in the company during her career, but also she was involved as well. So absolutely, it is really nice when you see somebody significant come to mind. And there are two people, and I'm thinking of them, and names are not coming to me, but you are absolutely right. I mean, we still are close with Diana Soviero, of course. Yep. And we're very, very fortunate that way to have some pretty spectacular, not only singers, but also just retired music folks, coaches and conductors and so forth. And it really does make for a fantastic local community to be able to call upon.
It leads into the last discussion we're going to have, but I first wanted to mention that Susan, like all of my guests, provide a list of listening for our viewers on Adagio, and they were Sofia, I want to pronounce her last name correctly, Sofia Gubaidalina, The Wrath of God, Mozart's Concerto for Horn and Orchestra No. 1, Renata Tebaldi, singing in this case from La Forza del Destino, but everything about Tebaldi, and the famous Maria Callas, Giuseppe Di Stefano, Tito Gobi, Tosca from 1953, especially the Te Deum. Why the Te Deum?
He's one of my favorite pieces of music. It's Gobi, of course, but the emotion that is conveyed in, I won't call it an aria by any means, that piece of music, it doesn't matter how many times I listen to it. The text, the way it's structured musically, I just find it absolutely fascinating. And it moves me every time I listen to it, when I hear it live, when I listen to a recording. Definitely one of my favorite pieces of music.
I've said this on other programs, but I'll say it to you. My father was a Tibaldi man 100%, but he felt that I should hear Maria Callas. And in 1965, when I was a little kid, he took me to one of the two Toscas. It was Franco Corelli and Tito Gobi. The other one had Richard Tucker, who I later would hear in other things. And so I'd never heard Callas, I'd never heard Gobi or Corelli. I was just a kid, and I'd never heard Tosca. And I will say that I didn't come away with a strong impression of Maria Callas because I didn't know, but I
Right.
did have a very strong impression about Tito Gobi and decided I needed to follow his career. And later I became his student many years, not that many years later, about 11 years later. So I agree with you about Gobi and the Te Deum. Now, the person I'd like to talk about, and we're doing this really to honor someone very special, is Brian Kello. Brian was born March 1st of 1959 and died July 2nd, 2018. If you do Fred Plotkin opera, you'll find my page at WQXR, and then enter Brian Kello, and you'll find the memory that I wrote about Brian. Brian, I met when he was fresh out of college. I was performance manager of the Met. The other performance manager was Cynthia Peterson, who was a childhood friend of Brian's from rural Oregon. They're both very tall, good-looking people and very outdoorsy in a way that Mr. New York City was not. And Brian was a blast of energy and brilliance and fun from the very beginning, hysterically funny, but also incredibly bright and intelligent. And Cynthia and I made sure that Brian got to see every opera he wanted to see. So although he was quite young, he saw and heard Sutherland and met Sutherland and Bonning and Pavarotti and Domingo and Takanawa, all the stars of that era. Rieseneck, met Nielsen through me, I remember. And so Brian had this foundation that made him, as an opera man, older than his age. And he went on to write wonderful books. I'll see if I can remember them all. Biographies of Pauline Kael, of the actresses, the Bennett sisters, of Eileen Farrell, the opera singer with the jazz bent, Ethel Merman. It's a wonderful book. And I know I'm leaving one out, but people should look up Brian Kello. He also became editor-in-chief of Opera News and then managing editor, and he was a columnist. He was highly opinionated. He and I think he would tell you this too, shared a sense of humor that we would laugh at things that nobody else would laugh at, and would find ourselves often in very embarrassing situations, such attending a play and sitting in the front row and bursting into uncontrollable laughter at a scene where you're not supposed to laugh. And his laughter was very infectious. But he also really was hard-headed about the business. He was uncompromising about quality. He was on the question of ethics, above reproach in every way, often in situations where he personally paid very dearly for sticking to his ethics, and paid for it dearly, I hate to say. And despite the stature that he achieved, he was abused by people who should have treated him with great care, which leads me to you. When he had a tough time in New York, and he continued to write his book, certainly, he told me that he was moving to Miami, which surprised me. And he said, well, I've had this wonderful job offer in a company that values me for who I am. So would you talk about how you knew of Brian and what made you hire him and so forth?
Well, Fred, when you in our back and forth getting ready for this wonderful program today, when you asked me about it, it just kind of was, it brought back a flood of memories, you know, some a little melancholy, but certainly great. And you might think that everybody wants to come and work in Miami, but it's not necessarily the case. You know, it's definitely not everyone's cup of tea. And as is always the case in the arts, when you're looking for someone on the administrative side, especially in marketing or development, there are a dearth of people who really know the art form. And I'm a real stickler on that. And I make people a little crazy, but I'm like, I don't know how you sell something if you don't like it. I mean, I know there are great salespeople that can do that, yet it's much better if, you don't have to explain to your PR person why someone should go to opera. So I remember I was just flipping through the resumes that had come through, and I looked and I went, Brian Kello? I literally did this because I could not believe that someone of that quality had applied for the job. And I certainly knew who he was from, being an opera news reader and, reading his pieces, seeing the stature of where he was at Opera News. And I was absolutely, I mean, pretty much he had the job if he wanted to come. And I just felt like it was more going to be us having to sell Brian on coming to Miami. But something that you said about him being, an Oregonian, and in some ways he really was like an outdoorsy country guy. And I kind of always figured that maybe Miami it really was in the middle, is about as different as you can get from the Pacific Northwest, yet it wasn't 100% city. And I have like the fondest memories because he was absolutely committed to not getting a car. And he would take public transportation, which I mean, the journey from where he lived in Miami in Edgewater neighborhood to where our office is. I live pretty close to where Brian used to live. He was at 26th and I live at 32nd. And it takes me maybe 18 minutes to get to work. It would take him 3 hours on public transportation. And it would be like, and we finally got him to, to kind of commute with several of us at various times. He kind of had his routine. He went into this place in the morning, got coffee. When you'd swing around and pick him up, he'd be standing there with his coffee. And, he would write in, especially with one of our coworkers at that time, Justin. And I cannot tell you what the value that he brought to this company. First of all, he was the center of attention always. He was very committed to not only doing an incredible job. We have publicity like we've never gotten. I was recognized in places that no one had ever gotten me recognition. And he was so committed to that. And he wasn't trying to kiss up to me. It's what you said. He had this principle. And
Brian didn't kiss up to anyone.
No. And and he was the center of the socialness of the staff. We were always at his little apartment. He was always entertaining. And I knew everything about his brother and his dad and his family. I don't think I'd ever gotten to know a staff member that quickly, so genuinely. My life is just very different for him having made the decision to leave New York and come and spend some time with us. An amazing human being, and his impact on the world, will not be forgotten in this community, in this company, and in the lives of many of my staff members.
I should just say, for its public record, he died of glioblastoma, which is a very aggressive form of brain cancer. And he has a wonderful husband, Scott Barnes, who I'm still in touch with. And Brian and Scott lived apart when Brian moved to Miami, which I knew was difficult for him. And then Scott came to Miami. And but Brian lived with their 2 cats, and was one of the first things that happened when he moved to Miami was a big hurricane. And as an Oregonian, he was used to trees falling in the forest, but not to that. And I know that he was a little undone by that hurricane. And would you talk from your side about getting Brian used to Miami?
Yeah, it was. I remember the cats. It was again that huge, kind heart. He went. There was a younger staff member who was doing volunteer work at the Humane Society, and she actually had a service animal, and so I think that she's the one that told Brian that it would help calm him down. But he did. It's just what you said, Fred. He landed. And we probably had the most significant hurricane in the 10 years I've lived in Miami. I mean, and I watched this happen with everyone. I've lived here long enough, so I've kind of had trop storms, Cat 1, Cat 2. But this was one where I think in my apartment, and I live up a bit, I think the winds were probably at 100 miles an hour. So it was the kind of thing that you lose power, you can't do anything because you go outside, and he lived very close to the bay. So there was like 3 feet of water outside of his apartment building. And it just really shakes you, because if you've never experienced, it's kind of like a winter howling wind times 100, and the windows are shaking, and then the lights go out, so you're sitting in the dark. So there was a lot of just holding everyone back together, and those of us who have been through it before just really checking in on others. But the cats were definitely a result of that.
Yeah.
And I can see them, and I can't remember their names, and that's terrible of me, but he adopted one, and there was another one who'd been exposed to an eye issue. So they had taken one of his eyes, and he's like, I gotta adopt them. Nobody else is going to adopt him.
Yeah.
So he came back to the office with 2 instead of 1 kitten, and actually, I would say spent a tidy sum on making sure that cat did not lose its other eye. And then they actually were able to kind of fix the eye that had, he got a real vet versus, like whatever they had to do at the, nothing against Humane Society, but, a little bit different. And those cats were the most amazing cats. And I think they were a total reflection of him. And
I'm laughing because he said to me, I want to name her Emily, but I can't.
And I can't.
Emily, for people who don't know, is the character in Verdi's Don Carlo.
Absolutely.
Who only has 1 eye.
And so yeah, the cats were definitely an incredible result of the hurricane, and they were such lucky cats, because he loved them so very much, and so did everybody else that went to visit. They were totally entertaining. They were not the cats that people don't like. There were those wonderful cats that are out and engaging, and they were pretty special, just like
he had cats from the time I knew him. The first one was named Vita, named for Vita Sackville West. And I would say to him, it was Vita Sackville West. He loved films. He knew cinema incredibly well. Or the daughter Vita in Mildred Pierce. And he sort of hissed like a cat sound, and he said, it depends on how she behaves.
Oh, gee.
He had engaged me to come do some work for your company, and then he got sick. So that never happened. But he was deeply engaged in his commitment to Florida Grand Opera. It was so interesting to me that everything that he brought to his career and his work, he brought to his job there. It was not, quote, retirement. It was not a cushy thing at all. He did it with the same passion and devotion, the way June LaBelle was that way too, about bringing the art form, not in a grand way, but in a way that infuses it with love and meaning. And now that's actually a good way for me to define Brian, as infusing his life with love and meaning. Susan, I know that you have a meeting. I would stay longer, but I really appreciate this conversation. You've really taught us a lot, and that was my goal for today, for people around the world to know about opera in South Florida, but to also know about the special challenges of running an opera company with diverse communities, with transportation, with pandemics, and so on. And Brian told me from the very beginning, this was a very Brian expression, she's the real deal, is the way he described you. And that's as high a compliment as Brian can pay to anyone. And he was right. So I thank you. And I look forward to following the company. And one day when pandemic permits, I will come and attend performances.
That would be fantastic. It's been such a pleasure, Fred, and a real honor to get to join you and your audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Be well. Happy
Take
New
care.
Year.
Bye, everyone.
Okay.